been a couple of months now since Ford released the redesigned Everest in the country and has been selling like hotcakes since. What we have here then is the mid-range Sport, and we want to answer one question. Does the Everest still impress, even if it's not a top-spec model? Right, so as mentioned, we are in the Everest Sport. So it's not somewhere in between the titanium and the entry-level trend. So you could sort of call this the mid-spec of the bunch. And it is powered by a 2-liter single-turbo diesel engine from Ford's EcoBlue family. Power is rated at 168 horsepower and torque a little over 400 Newton meters. Now, those are typically competitive in the two-wheel drive PPV or mid-size SUV segment. I do have to point out that power is a little bit lower compared to some of its rivals. So for example, you have the Nissan Terra, which has 190 horsepower, and so does the Isuzu Mu-X, which also has 190 horsepower with its 3-liter engine at least. Now the transmission is no longer the 10-speed automatic you get from the older Everest, at least the 4-wheel drive Everests. Now they reverted back to a 6-speed automatic. And that means that gearing is a little bit further spaced, but nothing wrong with that at all. Perhaps that's to reduce the complexity of having so many gears and whatnot. Now this transmission has what's called progressive range select. To be honest, I didn't know what that meant at first until I started using the manual mode in it. So progressive range select sort of pre-programs your gears to go from one gear to another. So gear shifts are smoother, but even if you don't use the manual modes, it seems that that's the default transmission mode of this Everest. But curiously, when you're out on the highway and trying to pass, you're not going to feel that typical surge from other turbo diesel engines. The only way you're going to notice you're going faster is the background suddenly moves faster and the speedometer is suddenly quickly approaching extra legal speeds. Now for the subject of fuel economy, and that's pretty important these days because 2022 has been a bad year for fuel prices, especially diesel. So in heavy city traffic, let's say averaging 16-17 kilometers per hour, it can still manage about 8.5 to 9 kilometers per. Out on the highway, this thing can clock up to 16 to 16.5 kilometers per liter. Now that's not bad at all considering I was doing a fair bit of passing, 80 to 100 kilometer passes, pretty long lines in the toll, so 16 kilometers per liter isn't bad at all. Now Ford says they went to great lengths into re-engineering the chassis of this, and do note that the frame of the Everest is still somewhat based on the previous generation model. It's not totally new per se. However, does it feel any different since Ford did mention that they did quite a lot to it? And I have to say that the ride is improved, mainly because of the extended wheelbase. Now normally anything with a longer wheelbase would ride better, but that goes beyond that. Even with the 20-inch alloys, it still rides well. It's still pretty supple, it's not jarring, and as far as I can tell, this is one of the better riding PPVs in the segment. Now let's talk handling, and for those who owned the previous generation Everest or Ranger, the steering was nice and light, if a little too light for some tastes. Not in this case anymore, because I'm glad to report there is more weight in the steering wheel. By weight, I don't mean it's heavy. By weight, I mean I can actually feel where the wheels are pointed this time around. I no longer have to make so many corrections when I'm out on the highway or when I'm cruising around the city. As far as truck-based SUVs goes, this is one of the nicer riding and nicer handling ones. And as far as driving the other ones, this perhaps feels most close to a crossover. Still doesn't feel totally like one, but keeping in mind that there's a huge frame underneath us right now, it's supposed to be a bit rough and a bit jarring, but that's not the case even in this mid-tier Sport. Now that we found a nice place to stop, it's a good time to discuss the interior of the Everest Sport. And for the 2023 model year, Ford has made an effort to make it look more truck-like and more macho than ever before. On the inside, if you could see this dashboard, it's pretty much cliff face, how flat that looks, and even the center stack and the screen. It's trying to be a bit like a baby expedition of sorts. As for other stuff, you have a lot of digitalization here. You have the digital instrument cluster and this huge infotainment screen right in the center. Practically somebody stuck an iPad right there. However, if you opt for the top of the line model, that screen becomes even bigger and it extends all the way down here, because the Sport model, along with anything lower than the Sport model, still has physical buttons right around here, and I do appreciate that. Of course, there are still some options here for your climate control on the screen, although that's up to you which one you want to use. As for storage spaces, well, you have two glove boxes. You have one for the dash top for smaller items, and of course the one down here for larger items. And not only that, Ford decides to look into the future and not to leave people in the past by providing two types of charging ports here. There's a USB-C port and a USB-A port. Moving up to the infotainment screen, as I mentioned, this houses your vehicle options and whatnot. It also has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, plus wireless Apple CarPlay, which you connect via Bluetooth. And for your battery not to get drained while using that mode, that's where this wireless charging pad comes in handy. And if you want to explore more of the infotainment screen, there are 6 dots up here for your menu, where you'll see radio, phone, media, Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, your owner's manual, and, curiously, games. So you press that and you get a sketch pad. We really don't know what it's for or why it's called a game. It's more of a sketch pad, but I wouldn't recommend using this while you're on the move. And now I don't know how to erase it. If you're coming from the previous generation Everest, you're probably used to this already. But if you're coming from a Japanese mark, this might throw you off a bit. And that's the buttons on the steering wheel. Normally, we have the audio controls on the left-hand side and the cruise control on the right-hand side. But for the Everest, it's the other way around. So this might confuse you a little bit. There's another design quirk in here too, aside from the switched buttons, and that's the door handle. They hidden it somewhere by the grab handle, and you have to grab onto the whole thing to open it. Lastly, I do appreciate Ford finally putting a telescopic wheel in the Everest and the Ranger. What I don't understand is why they removed the adjustable seatbelt height lever for both models. Why can't we have both? But still, it's a nice and cozy place to be in. The seats are nice and comfortable, they're soft enough and firm in the right places, and you even get lumbar support adjustment for the Sport model. But that's the entire front covered. Let's go to the second row. Now I know I have a habit of making interiors look larger than they actually appear, but the Everest is properly spacious. Now, the seat is adjusted to my height, so it does look like I'm sitting at the back of a Maybach. But even if a taller driver sits up here, there's still enough room back here. And if that's not enough, you can also slide the seats back and forth if needed. And another thing is, the windowsills aren't too high. Well, if you guys saw the Stargazer video, the windowsill was practically up to my head. But that's not the case here in the Everest. It's actually by my shoulders, giving you a little more light into the cabin and giving you more of that sense of spaciousness. And did you notice anything about the window? It rolls all the way down. This might as well be a good candidate for Top Gear's camera car. This being the Sport model, it doesn't have the massive panoramic sunroof. Other things to see at the back here, well, to be honest, not much. But you do get 2 USB ports here, and like the ones at the front, you have a USB-A and a USB-C port. And just to make life a lot simpler, your aircon controls are right here by the center console. If you want more stuff here, again, you'll have to go for the titanium models. Now what about third row accommodations? Oh, this second row is pushed all the way back, so I'm supposed to be jammed up here, but I still have about this much legroom left. Although it is nice that there is footroom underneath it, so you can just slide your feet underneath the second row seats. However, even for someone my size, who's 5'3", headroom isn't the best. I have about this much left, so if you're planning to put anyone taller back here, well, I don't think you guys are going to be friends for that long. So really, this area is best reserved for children or adults my size. Now, I've taken myself out of the third row. Let's look at the cargo area. And for the Sport, it comes with a power-operated tailgate. Now, the space behind the third row, well, it's not as bad as you think it is. A couple of overnight bags easily squished in there, and you could stack them all up, no problem. But what about space behind the second row, which is going to be the usual configuration, let's be honest. So let's put that away and pull this tab to fold the third row down. And as you can see, it's got a large cargo area, even without folding all the seats down. Now, if you do, you'll get over 2,000 liters of space. And while we're back here, we actually saw a neat little Easter egg. So if you go to the toolkit area, right here, there's a mini Everest in every Everest. And the Easter eggs don't stop there, because if you take a look at the rear windshield, there are two little things in each corner. So you have the mountain here, which I would assume is Everest. And on the other side, you have a cityscape. Interesting. And while we're back here, we might as well talk about the design of the Everest. And seems to be a trend going along in the industry these days, wherein they connect the two taillights in one whole piece like this, and the Everest is no exception. Now, some people like it, some people don't. There's a bit of futurism here with those LED slats going on, and I just noticed this now. This entire trim encases the word Everest, and I'm pretty sure by now someone from Banao has figured out how to light up the word Everest. Please don't do that. But what about the side? Well, it's more boxy and more angular before. You'll see more hard-edged character lines compared to the previous gen Everest. But when you look at it as a whole, you won't mistake it for anything else. And that's a good thing, because the older Everest was a handsome-looking thing from the side as well. Now let's go to the front. Now, this is the major talking point of the new Everest, not just because it's the front end, but it's mainly because of these C-shaped headlights. Now, some people like it, some people don't. Some people say that it makes the Everest look very flat-faced. Either way, Ford has taken it a different direction, and it's definitely not conservative. The jury's still out on styling, but you can't deny that it is a bold take nonetheless. Again, this is the Sport Edition, so all of the chrome has been replaced by gloss black trim. And to remind everyone that you are in an Everest, they even spelled it out in front for you in gloss black. You also get a gloss black drill and more gloss black trimmings down here. So what do we think of the Ford Everest Sport? Well, let's run it by its pros and cons. So, pros, the drivetrain is much smoother, and the comfort, even on these huge 20-inch alloys, is better than before. And that's a huge feat, because the older Everest was already pretty comfortable as it is. So the fact that they improved that is a big deal already. Plus, you have better efficiency, and that's despite the fact that it has 4 less gears than the older model. So Ford probably did some magic there, but we do appreciate the extra economy. Practicality, there's no arguing with that, and the space at the back. As for cons, again, there's the love or hate styling, although some people will appreciate the boldness, some people might find it too daring, but nonetheless, there's that. And there are a few cost-cutting measures there, such as the removal of the seatbelt height adjuster. For some people, the older Everest might be easier to use, might be easier to get acclimated with immediately. Admittedly, I had to make a few adjustments here, namely with the inverted controls and the cat flap door handles. As for the competition, the Sport competes against models such as the Fortuner LTD, Montero Sport GT two-wheel drive, NUX LSE, and Nissan Terra VL 4x2. And the price, well, it's 2,089,000 pesos. So it's wedged somewhere in between in those price points against its competitors. Now it's up to you if it's good value or not, but for what it has to offer, you should take a good look at this. If you were to score this out of 10, perhaps an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10.